All right, so welcome back, everyone. I last week decided to kind of dig into one of my old textbooks, and I was talking to y'all about family systems theory, specifically family paradigms, and I realized I gave you a whole ton of information, but I didn't tell you where I got it from. So, let me really quick, you're going to hear a little rustling of papers from all my crazy notes. But the information I shared last week is from Introduction to Family Processes, 5th edition by Randall D. Day. And a lot of what I'm going to share today is from the same book. And as I said last time, I get a lot of questions that go back to boundaries in families. Like a lot of issues people have or problems people have really end up going back to boundaries. And it's hard to understand a boundary, a family system boundary or healthy boundaries. This is a term that gets thrown around in society all the time, unless you know what a system is. So we went over the, different family paradigms to define the systems and ways families think. But today I want to talk more about boundaries in general. So, yeah, lots to talk about. Super excited. And as usual, I am your host, Sam Wolf, and this is Life of a Military Wife. Okay, so let's have some fun with this, or at least I hope it's fun. I really frequently, every family, every system has struggles. And these systems are more than just families. There are systems in school systems, community systems, church congregations will have their own kind of system. Each family has their own, like I said. So they all have these ways that they function and interact in amongst themselves. But system boundaries occur when there are two or more systems or subsystems that interface or interact with each other. And these borders of the systems sometimes are called boundaries, and sometimes they're very solid or rigid, and other times they can be permeable. And we'll get into more of, examples of permeable and solid. But again, last time I gave the whole example of a drawbridge. There's some family systems that are very closed, and they only allow people in occasionally, and that's the drawbridge going down. So I'm sure everyone's met families that are just super tight-knit. They like doing everything together. They like spending time together. Family time is important. And so they really don't have other people in their space often. And that's fine. That's a really rigid idea of a boundary. More common is boundaries that are porous, like a sieve, where some things they're flexible on. And we'll talk about all of that soon. But understanding where a boundary is and what rules they are that construct these boundaries is important. And what's permeable about the boundary. So who is allowed over to a family's house and when? We don't typically have there's like certain things we don't do on Sundays, for example, because that's the Sabbath and we go to church and things like that. So there's just certain things we don't do on Sundays. So that's kind of an example of that rules. Like we wouldn't have a birthday party on a Sunday. We'd have friends over for dinner sometimes on Sundays, but we wouldn't have a birthday party. And that's one of those, like, they kind of seem the same. So, but it's just how we function. Who's allowed in certain parts of the home? I know families where the kids are not allowed to get into the refrigerator or the pantry without permission, and other families where there's not an issue with that. And honestly, both systems work fine, and there's reasons for both. Maybe the family that the kids are allowed to get into the pantry and the refrigerator have teenagers, and so they are fine with it. Whereas where they don't, it's toddlers. So there's different reasons for these rules, but these rules are help define the boundaries or the expectations in a family. Um, or if you're allowed to play in bedrooms when you have friends over, or if you're not allowed to have people play in bedrooms, or things like that. Are the kids allowed to go into their parents' bedroom? Are they allowed to go into the parents' office? Different things. Who is considered part of the family? One of the examples of this is parenting. Is it acceptable to parent other people's children? Or are you okay with people parenting your children? And to a degree, yes or no, we're fine with that. But to a degree, like I would not be okay with someone I don't know spanking my child. I'm not okay with that. But if a neighbor sees my kid run across the street and nearly get hit by a car and corrects them, heck yes, totally on board for that. So what is the boundaries? Where are those expectations and rules? Some members of my own family, I'm allowed to correct their children. And other members of my family don't want anyone else correcting or parenting their children. So that's a boundary. And that's okay. That's a healthy boundary as long as both systems know about it. So I made the mistake one time of parenting one of my cousins who is 15, 20 years younger than me, 21 years younger than me. So this cousin's drastically younger than me. He's not much older than my own children. And I made the mistake of correcting that cousin. And my aunt very rightly explained to me that she was not comfortable with that. She did it in a really nice, really appropriate way. And I've not done that since. And because she explained the boundary to me in a kind, polite, healthy way, we've not had any issues because I understand and I respect that boundary. So that was a healthy boundary for her to set for her and her family. I respect that boundary by not, breaking it and trying to parent them. And so that's an example. We'll talk more about those sorts of things. And then the other thing is who can correct who? And there's going to be subsystems in families. So you've got the individual, so maybe the individual parent like me, and then you've got the parent group, the mom and dad or whatever, the parental group. And then you have the children subgroup. And so there's boundaries even between that. Are the kids allowed to correct their parents? Are the parents allowed to correct each other in front of the kids? That sort of thing. Can the kids correct each other? Those are all boundaries and rules that would fall into it. And it depends on your family. I'm going to be turning pages in my notes because I took tons of notes while going through all this. But all of those things, everything like I talked about with the systems, if it's handled with agreement from all members of the system and understanding and love, they can all be healthy. It gets unhealthy when we get into things like, we'll talk about vicious cycles in a bit, and when you have people challenging the boundaries because they feel like it's stifling themselves or it's too restrictive or they don't understand the reason for the boundary or the rules. So there's a lot of different things. So we're going to talk about boundary rules right now. Boundary rules and interactions with other systems, and we mentioned this briefly, like schools, churches, other families, the military. Because come on, we've got to take it back to the military wife. That's what I do. So there's times where the military really Ooh, yeah. The military really encroaches on boundaries in families. It encroaches on family time and all sorts of things. And it affects the rules in families that we have and how we interact with them. So, for example, are there rules on how your family system interacts with other family systems? So, for example, when you have other kids over to your house to play with your kids, do they have to help clean up toys afterwards? Um, or do they not have to? Are those explained? Because sometimes we've been over to some friends' houses and my kids have tried to help clean up, and their parents are like, no, they're not allowed to do that. No, 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 no. I want everything put away a certain way. Don't let your kid. And I was just like, oh, okay, sorry. Um, and they got a little stressed. And once they explained, everything was fine. But they got a little stressed at first. And I was like, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to offend you. I thought we were helping. So yeah, it's just explaining those boundaries and those rules. Um, the Army doesn't always explain very well. Plus, the Army, like I said before, you may have this family boundary or family system where people are home for dinner. You eat dinner together as a family. That's great in theory. The military does its own thing. There are times where they're going to be working and they're not going to make it home for dinner. So that's when we get into exceptions. Exceptions and challenges to those rules. Um, so it might be, you know what, we have dinner at 5:30 every night, even if daddy's not home. Everyone else has to be, but if the Army, Air Force, Navy, whatever keeps daddy, then daddy's not home for dinner or mommy's not home for dinner. Or another exception could be we have bedtime, like the kids are in bed, bedtime is 8 o'clock, period, except for holidays. Then the kids can stay up later. So that would be an example of permeability, or that sieve concept that I talked about, where there's some flex to those rules. And the more rigid the boundaries are, the harder it's going to be to compensate for exceptions or challenges or just things that life that comes up. And sometimes these boundaries will have to change as your family develops and grows. For example, we were talking about who has the right to get into the refrigerator. I will tell you this straight up. My toddlers did not have the right to get into the refrigerator whenever they felt like it, largely because they would just pull food out and leave it places, and it would go bad. So we had a refrigerator lock for that purpose. And so that's one of those situations where that rule has changed. That boundary has changed in our family as our kids have gotten older. Our kids are allowed to get into the refrigerator now. So it's a little bit more permeable. However, they are only allowed to get into the refrigerator and get approved snacks. And those approved snacks are like, fruits, vegetables, cheese sticks, something like that. I don't want them getting in and eating, something I have saved for a dinner, or something like that. So there's still a boundary there, but it's a little bit more permeable. And the important thing is there's implicit and explicit rules in families. There's rules that you just kind of know. Like, for example, at least I hope people know this, the general implicit rule of don't take things that aren't yours. Now, that's something you might have to explain to a toddler. But that's an implicit rule. Most people know when they go over to someone's house that they shouldn't take something that isn't theirs. An explicit rule are things like, please don't parent my kids, that sort of thing. Something that you might have to explain, those boundaries. And it's okay to set those healthy boundaries. I feel like sometimes we as military families get uprooted and transplanted so much that there is a tendency to be like super rigid with boundaries or to be uncomfortable having boundaries at all. And both extremes can be unhealthy. Having too rigid of boundaries so that you cut yourself off and are isolated to the point where you don't feel support or have the resources you need can be detrimental to your family system. However, the opposite of being just completely open with no boundaries just because you're desperate to have people to connect to can also be adverse because your kids don't know what to expect because everything changes every time they move anywhere. So, but there are always going to be exceptions, especially with military life. I know for myself, when it comes to rules of responsibility, which is another aspect of boundaries, who's expected to do what in a household? Or what are people's general roles and responsibilities? Like, do your kids have chores? Do they not have chores? That's a boundary thing. Are there certain chores they're not allowed to do? Like, for example, I highly doubt most people would let their young kids work on the car. That's just, doesn't make sense. In our family, dad typically takes care of car. But when dad's away with the military, then it becomes mom's responsibility. So there's rules and responsibilities, but again, there's adaptation and exceptions because the military requires it. For example, finances, budgeting, we try to do that together. Me and my husband try to do that together. We don't include the kids in that. That's our role and responsibility. However, when he's gone, it becomes just mine. So there's this adaptation and going back and forth of fluctuating with boundaries. So there's a certain level of flexibility and permeability is fine. It's perfectly fine. But making sure you have those healthy boundaries, those expectations is important because that is what helps your family system function. When each member of the family understands the expectations and agree with them and are on board with them, the family unit functions better, which I think is just a given. Most people understand that concept. But it just got me thinking a lot about, okay, what are some unhealthy boundaries or vicious cycles or different things that people can run into and not recognize it. So a vicious cycle is a concept that I think everyone has probably seen, but very few people recognize it. And I'm going to give an example about, this is the one my professor gave me, and it sticks in my head because it's just very relatable. My professor had a kid who was not taking school seriously, and they had a family tradition or boundary or, expectation that they would all eat dinner together. And at dinner, they would go around and ask about how school was going or how work was going. And they would talk about it. Well, they would get around and they'd get around to this one child, and the one child would be like not wanting to talk about it, not wanting to participate in this family ritual routine. And then the parent would get upset because they weren't wanting to talk about school, and then they'd accuse them for not taking school seriously, and they're like, all you care about is school, you don't care about, and I don't remember the exact gist of it, but basically it would devolve into this argument. And one day, one of the other children, it got to the point where the one kid who was struggling with school was asked, how's school? And one of the siblings chimes in and is like, oh, not again. You're going to ask how school is, and they're going to say, I don't want to talk about it. And then you're going to say you don't take school. And literally this other sibling quoted verbatim this whole argument that they had been having almost every single night. And that was when my professor realized, here I am. He was a professor in teaching, family therapy sorts of stuff and all this system stuff. And he's like, oh my goodness, I've gotten myself into a vicious cycle. So everybody, it happens to everyone. It really does. But recognizing it is so important. Recognizing that you get into these systems, these routines that are not healthy. So, for example, years and years ago, a person I know was struggling with their older parent. Their older parent was very lonely and really wanted to just have people around all the time, which is understandable that they would want family around and friends around because they were lonely. The problem was it was getting to the point where they wanted someone around all the time, which just didn't function because their family had other obligations. They had work and school and kids and other things they absolutely had to get done, like doctor's appointments and stuff. But the expectation was that if grandparent was lonely, they had to drop everything and just be there for them. And that wasn't a very healthy expectation. And so the individual, my friend was talking to me about how they had to set a boundary with their parent. And they had to explain, okay, I have work, I have kids, I've got doctor's appointments of my own, I've got things I have to do. I'm willing to help you with your laundry on X day of the week, or I'm willing to help you gardening on Y day of the week. They're like, I will be here for you and you can count on that. This day, these times, and I will help you with this. And that's setting a boundary. And it really actually improved their relationship with their aging parent, because then the parent had something to look forward to and be excited about. And they were still able to get what they needed to do done in their personal life. So that is an example of setting a healthy boundary. So sometimes when these vicious cycles happen, like I was mentioning before, and I just realized I switched straight to healthy boundary and didn't resolve vicious cycles. Vicious cycles, once we recognize we're in a vicious cycle, one of the main things we have to do is step back and kind of analyze our participation in that vicious cycle. So I guess in essence, the situation that my friend was experiencing had become kind of a vicious cycle. Their mom or dad would call all the time asking for help with X, Y, and Z, and then they would feel guilty saying no, or they'd say yes and then resent it, and it just kept happening and happening. So yeah, that actually was a vicious cycle, thinking about it. And the way they broke that vicious cycle was by recognizing that they did not want to feel guilty or resentful towards their parent. They wanted to be able to enjoy time with their parent. And so by setting a healthy boundary, by setting expectations that they were both comfortable with, that met both of their needs, without infringing on either of them, they were able to have healthy, happy interactions, which is really what the goal was. And there's been times like that in our family where we've had to step back and realize that we've gotten into a vicious cycle of, and I think this was one of my issues with when we first joined the military. I would want to know when my husband had to be at work. And his leadership at one time, was not good at communicating when he needed to be at work. And so I would ask him, when do you need to go to work? And he'd be like, I don't know. And I'm like, that bugs me. I need to know so I can plan. So he would call his boss, and his boss is like, well, if you're bored and he's like, if you're calling, that means, you're ready to come to work. So come into work early. And it happened over and over and over again. Till finally I clued in, and he kind of helped me see he was having to go into work 2 and 3 hours earlier than anyone else on his shift just because he would call and ask when he was supposed to be into work. And I had to let that go. I had to let knowing when he was going to have to show up to work go. which is really sad. And that's not the way the military should work. They really should explain ahead of time clearly to their service members that are underneath them when they should be at work. But it just doesn't always happen. It doesn't. And I had to let that go so that we could have more family time together, and I could enjoy the family time we had together. And so that was, once we realized that we'd gotten into this kind of vicious cycle of, I would start stressing about, okay, how much longer are you going to be home? And I would nag him to call his, direct line, and his direct line would be like, well, if you are asking, then obviously you're ready to come into work, so come now. And he'd have to leave right away. And then I'd be angry because he was having to go to work, and he'd get there and he'd realize that no one else had to be in for another 3 hours, and he'd call me upset because he's like, I had to come in early because you wanted to know, and then we'd get into an argument. And anyway, that was our little vicious cycle. And once he was able to, outside of a work day, outside of the cycle, pull me aside and say, this is what's going on. He is making me come in early because he thinks I don't want to be at home because you're having me call and ask when I have to be at work. So why don't we just wait for them to tell me? And that was stressful, but we ended up having more time together as a family. So yeah, woohoo, wonderful military life there. But basically, what I wanted to get to is there's also good cycles or systems. So you'll get into these rule systems. A vicious cycle is a bad one, but you'll have other rule systems that will be helpful or beneficial. Most people will think of the type of rule system I'm about to explain as like a routine. So for our kids, we have a bedtime routine, which would be considered a rule system. They're supposed to go to bed by a certain time, but instead of just walking them up to the room at that time and saying, go to bed, we, about a half hour before, will send them up to get changed into their pajamas, and then we'll brush teeth, and then we'll, because pajamas and teeth can take a while sometimes. But that's a rule system, that they need to put on pajamas before they go to bed, that they need to brush their teeth before they go to bed. Then we do prayers, and then we'll sing them a song. And then it's actual time to sleep. So that's a rule system. There's an expectation of what's going to happen to meet a certain objective. So anyway, that's a whole lot of information to kind of do all in one episode. If you would like more information on boundaries, vicious cycles, how to set healthy boundaries, any of those sorts of things, please let me know. I would love to revisit those topics in detail and clarify. Like I said, a lot of the information I've shared today is from that one textbook. It's Intro to Family Processes by Ronald D. Day. But there is another book I really want to share with you about boundaries. I love it. I have given this book out to numerous friends. My husband jokes that we've bought or received more copies of this book than almost any other book, and we still don't ever have a copy because I give them away. But we have the Audible, so it's on Audible, people. It's great. It's called Boundaries, and it's by John Townsend and Henry Cloud, and it is incredible. It is a really great book. If you don't have time to sit and read it, get it on Audible. It's really great to listen to. I love that book. It has helped a lot. So I really hope that this kind of, helps in some way with your ability to handle the systems that you're in and regulate, basically how the military affects your family. But that said, I am your host, Sam Wolf, and this is Life of a Military Wife.